Coming up on New Day at Arirang, Omicron running rampant in South Korea. New COVID-19 infections could top 40,000 for the first time on Monday, doing what they can to try and stem the spread. Health authorities extend social distancing guidelines for another 2 weeks. South Korea lose 3-2 to China to finish runner-up at this year's top Asian women's football tournament. Despite the loss, it's the best performance by South Korea at the Women's Asian Cup, having only finished as high as third some 20 years ago. Plus, we are exactly 30 days away from the 2022 presidential election in South Korea, with the two frontrunners Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeol essentially neck and neck in opinion polls. It could be a photo finish in the race to the Blue House.
Hello and welcome to this Monday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. February 7th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Brumo. Over the course of the next hour, we will be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. We start, though, with the COVID-19 situation. South Korea is set to see well over 30,000 new cases of COVID-19 on Monday, possibly as many as 40,000, as cases still soar despite the weekend effect when, generally speaking, fewer people get tested.
And starting today, new antivirus measures will be in place for facilities exempt from vaccine pass mandates, and social distancing has been extended for another 2 weeks. For more on this, our reporter Choi Min-jung is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Min-jung.
Good morning.
So like always, let's start with how many cases are we expecting for today?
Mo-gyan, we're expecting the daily tally to surpass the 30,000 mark once again. From midnight to 9 p.m. on Sunday, South Korea saw more than 27,700 cases. It's once again the highest ever recorded for this time period. The figure soared by more than 900 cases from the previous high set the day before, while it has nearly doubled compared to a week ago. We usually tend to see cases drop during the weekend as fewer people get tested, but with Omicron spreading rapidly, we saw record high figures over the past couple of days. On Sunday, the country's total caseload surpassed the 1 million mark in 750 days since the outbreak of the pandemic. According to authorities, it took the longest time for South Korea to reach this grim milestone out of 13 OECD countries with a population size smaller than Korea.
Min-jung, from this Monday, stronger measures will be implemented in places of learning here in South Korea, and authorities are set to announce new regulations as the school semester is about to start here.
That's right, Mark. Starting today, facilities that do not require vaccine passes, including cram schools and study cafes, will enforce stronger antivirus measures. In places of learning, people must sit 1 seat apart if there are no partitions in between seats. The measure is mainly meant to reduce contact as much as possible. There will be a grace period until the 25th, so until then, people won't be asked to pay fines when caught violating the rules. Also today, the Ministry of Education will be announcing antivirus measures for the new semester. Authorities have said they will put priority on allowing in-person learning as much as possible, but with Omicron spreading, they will also allow local governments to be flexible with restrictions in their own regions. They're also considering introducing rapid antigen tests in schools in addition to PCR testing. The Education Minister said that its main goal is to minimize loss of learning and guarantee students the right to learn. However, there are still growing concerns over the increasing number of infections among teenagers. Currently, 1 in 4 people who have contracted the virus are under 20 years old. Breaking the figure down, 10% are under 10 and 15% between 10 and 20. Experts have predicted that the number of confirmed cases in this age group may reach 30,000 a day by the end of this month.
Then, Min-jung, are there any other changes that we need to be aware about?
Well, it's not much of a change, but social distancing measures are extended for another 2 weeks starting today. Until the 20th, the social gathering cap will continue to be limited to 6 people, and most businesses like restaurants and cafes will have to close by 9 p.m. Also starting today, eating and holding promotional events in department stores and supermarkets will be banned. Like the new measures implemented for cram schools, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a 3-week grace period. The age requirement for oral COVID-19 treatment will also be expanded from today. Pfizer's Paxlovid had only been prescribed to those aged 60 and over, but now people aged 50 and over can also receive the medication.
And on the treatment front, authorities have increased the number of clinics and smaller hospitals that can provide this so-called new one-stop service in a bid to try and handle this surge in Omicron cases.
Right, Mark. Health authorities have designated around 300 more local hospitals and clinics for conducting rapid antigen tests and treating patients. This brings the total number up to 780. Combined with the number of respiratory clinics, there are a total of 1,100 hospitals and clinics providing the service nationwide. Although the government is doing its best to expand the number of clinics, there are concerns that the measures are still not keeping pace with the current surge in cases. As of Sunday, close to 13,000 patients are being treated at home. This is 79% of the 16,000 patients medical institutions can handle. With the rapid increase in infections, the medical system is currently facing challenges to deliver oral treatment and home treatment kits in time.
Well, let's hope the new measures get systemized as soon as possible. Thank you so much for your report, Min-jung.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zoi's Min-jung, for that report. Now, following a series of missile tests by North Korea, including the launch of an intermediate-range ballistic missile, the nuclear envoys of South Korea, the United States and Japan will meet on Thursday in Hawaii.
Joining the meeting are South Korea's No Kyu-duk, his American counterpart Sung Kim, and Japan's Takehiro Funakoshi. The agenda includes the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula and ways to resume dialogue with Pyongyang. Separately, No will hold bilateral meetings with his U.S. and Japanese counterparts. On Saturday, the top diplomats of the three countries will also meet in Hawaii for talks on North Korea. The three nuclear envoys will join as well. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is warning a Russian invasion of Ukraine could happen any day from now. During an interview on Fox News Sunday, Sullivan said the U.S. needs to be prepared for every possible contingency, even before the Beijing Winter Olympics come to an end. However, Sullivan also said Moscow could still choose a diplomatic solution. Separately, an advisor to Ukraine's president says there is a greater chance to resolve tensions with Russia through diplomacy than through conflict.
Back here in South Korea, there are exactly 30 days left until millions of people in South Korea head to the polls to elect their next president. According to the latest opinion polls, it's still remarkably close between the two frontrunners, the candidates from the ruling party and the main opposition party. Watchers say young voters, as well as the remaining televised debates, could potentially be the key factors that push the pendulum one way or the other. Lee Kyung-eun with this report.
5 years on from the presidential election of 2017 held early due to the impeachment of then-President Park Geun-hye. That year, the Democratic Party rode to victory on a wave of support for political reform. Now the DP will seek to stay in power and push ahead with its agenda, while the conservative bloc is hoping to win redemption. At this point, the winner is uncertain. Polls suggest around 50% of South Koreans support a change of government. But the incumbent President Moon Jae-in has an approval rating above 40%, which is higher than any previous leader when they left office. Currently, the polls show no candidate with a majority. The two frontrunners are Lee Jae-myung of the ruling DP and Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party, who are neck and neck. Also with small but significant levels of support are the Justice Party's Shim Sang-jung and An Chol-soo of the minor opposition People's Party. The landscape could change at any time given the possibility of Yoon and An merging their campaigns in a strategic alliance. Another deciding factor could be the young adults in their 20s and 30s. They're seen as a generation of so-called pragmatic voters who lack political allegiances and who choose the candidates they see as benefiting them the most. Older voters, however, indicate clear preferences for particular candidates. People in their 40s and 50s go for Lee, while those in their 60s and 70s go for Yoon. These young people also have the biggest proportion of voters who are undecided. That's why there is growing attention on the debates, which will give them a closer look at the candidates' policies. They're also looking at questions of ethics, given that the two leading candidates have yet to completely put to rest scandals surrounding themselves and their families. The first televised debate between the four main candidates was held last week, and discussions about another one are underway. These early engagements are separate from the three debates required by law, which will begin after the candidates are officially registered on February 13th and 14th. Young은, Arirang News.
Continuing on with our coverage of the presidential election, South Korea is set for what will be the nation's 20th presidential election. For more on what the process will entail over the next 30 days and what voters need to know before they head to their local polling stations, our Kim Do-yeon reports.
There are now only 30 days to go until South Korea picks its next president. Let's take a look at what's ahead in this short month that'll shape the country's next 5 years. First, in a couple days, local districts will start sending preliminary lists of the voters in their district to the National Election Commission. This is called the completing of the electoral roll. The NEC will start finalizing the list, and during this process, individuals can double-check that they're registered to vote in the right district. The aim is for the NEC to find out how many voters there'll be in each place to prevent election fraud. While this process goes on, the candidates will officially register. That's on the 13th and 14th of this month. Right now, they're only preliminary candidates because the official campaign period doesn't start until the 15th. When it does kick off, they'll be allowed to campaign more loudly and more actively. Candidates and their supporters will go around the country holding rallies amplified by microphones and loudspeakers. The streets will be lined with posters and banners. Trucks with supporters on board will bring campaign music to every neighborhood, and ads will start to air on TV. About a week into campaigning, the first ballots will be cast, but outside of the country, in 5 days of overseas voting. By the 25th of the month, the Election Commission will have completed its list of domestic voters. Those who can't make it to the polling station in their home district on Election Day will have a chance to cast their ballots elsewhere, even at the airport, if need be, a few days in advance. Otherwise, on Election Day, voters have to go to their designated polling station. Finally, on March 9th, the nation will observe a public holiday, not only to vote for the next president, but also to celebrate the country's democratic process and another peaceful transition of power. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Now it's time for Onpoint, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. New daily COVID-19 cases in South Korea topped 38,500 on Sunday. That is a record high for the country. On top of that, the number of infections is forecast to keep rising exponentially due to the highly virulent Omicron strain. Health authorities are saying they wouldn't actually be that surprised to see new daily cases in the six-figure range in the near future. On top of that, the accumulated virus caseload in South Korea has also exceeded 1 million just 2 years after the country reported its first case. However, the fatality rate is dipping, and the number of critically ill patients has dropped below 300 after being at around 1,100 a few weeks ago prior to Omicron's arrival.
And also from today, the current social distancing guidelines have been extended for another 2 weeks. For more, we connect on the phone with Dr. Alice Tan, internist at Ms. Midi Women's Hospital in Seoul. Good morning, Dr. Tan.
Good morning.
So firstly, considering the explosion in new cases, are you content with the decision to extend the current social distancing guidelines for another 2 weeks?
There's no question that the Omicron wave has the potential to bring about a huge surge in hospitalizations and deaths here in Korea. In the UK, where 65.2% of the population older than 12 years has received a booster shot, they are logging close to 639,000 new cases over the last 7 days. And at the peak of their Omicron wave, there were about 19,000 new hospital admissions per day. So extending the measures for another 2 weeks, I think, was the bare minimum to try to manage this current wave. Some parts of the country, such as the Honam region and Gangwon province, I think may have benefited from tighter restrictions, however.
Now, Doctor, when Omicron first hit South Korea a few weeks ago, officials were really sounding the alarm about the health system being overwhelmed like it never has been before. It's still clearly very tough for medical staff, but that did not happen. The health system is still functioning. So what do you think is really going on in that regard? And do we still trust at this point the current COVID prediction models?
Well, hospitalizations and deaths always lag behind cases. First of all, as of February 4th, the number of COVID ICU beds available in the entire Gangwon province had fallen to 50. And on Jeju Island, there are only 22 ICU beds left. So there are already regions where the healthcare system is definitely feeling the strain of Omicron, and cases have not yet peaked. And so this is very worrisome. Secondly, over the weekend, we may have passed the inflection point in the epidemic curve of current ICU cases. After many weeks of continuous decline, the number of cases currently in ICUs has increased for 2 days in a row. And we will see this week if this is the start of a dangerous upward trend. Third, the number of cases aged 60 and older was nearly 5,000 yesterday, which is a new record for our country. And we have seen a steady rise in this number since January 18th. And the critical questions are, how many of these cases are unvaccinated or partially vaccinated? And subsequently, how many of these elderly, high-risk individuals will become severely ill? Lastly, there are some provinces where the epidemic surveillance system is so overwhelmed, they've essentially stopped reporting on active clusters. This indicates an escalation of transmission level from discrete clusters and outbreaks to widespread community transmission. And so I think the upcoming week to 10 days will let us know if our aggressive booster campaign was enough of a defensive barrier against the Omicron wave, because, as I said, there's always a lag time, and next week is when we'll find out.
And Dr. Tan, 85% of people in South Korea have had at least 2 COVID-19 vaccine shots, and well over half of the population has had a booster. Now, could this mean that vaccination campaigns are not working?
So clearly 2 shots are not enough to prevent infection with Omicron, especially if more than 3 months have elapsed since the second dose because of waning of effectiveness, or if the AstraZeneca vaccine was used for either the first or second dose of the first 2 doses. Some experts now consider the appropriate schedule for COVID vaccines to be a 3-dose prime series for most adults. In other words, you are not fully immune unless you have received 3 shots. And of course, in Korea, only 55% of our total population has received a 3rd shot. But the really important fact that must be recognized is that vaccines are holding their ground in terms of preventing many hospitalizations and progression to severe disease. So in this regard, vaccines are certainly working. Vaccinations are working. As of January 31st, vaccine effectiveness against death in our country was 87.7%, and against severe disease, it was 91.2%, which are both considered high levels of protection.
Okay, just briefly, I just want to pick on something you said there. You said that if someone has had a booster shot, they are immune from catching Omicron.
Well, we do have breakthrough infections after 3rd shot boosters as well. But in terms of your risk of hospitalization or death, it's much very, very low.
Okay. So finally, if South Korea follows what we've seen in other countries, which we expect it will do, we'll see this period of exponential growth in Omicron cases, then a kind of plateauing out. Now, countries that have completed that cycle, or many of them anyway, will or have already lifted all COVID-19 restrictions. In your view, once Korea comes out the other side of this, should it follow suit and we should make a real effort to go back to some semblance of normalcy?
So the decision to lift restrictions is very complex, and it depends on many different factors. First, I think if we look at the downslope of the Omicron wave in other countries, we'll notice that there is a lengthy tail with a high level of new cases. For example, in South Africa, their current 7-day average of daily new cases is still around 3,000, which is 10 times higher than their transmission level prior to Omicron. Back then, it was only 300 cases per day. So the question is, will hospitals have the capacity to deal with this high plateau that we will come down to? Secondly, I think a lot depends on the level of vaccination that we achieve in our country. If we can deliver third dose boosters to 80 to 90% of the population older than 12, and 2 doses to 80% of children aged 5 to 11, then we can maybe think about easing some restrictions. But as it is, I think there's still too many people, about 3.2 million adults, who are either unvaccinated or partially vaccinated in our country. Third, in the context of suboptimal vaccination rates in the total population, the first-generation antiviral pills, that's molnupiravir and Paxlovid, I think they're too limited in their scope of use and effectiveness to allow for a full, safe return to normal. And lastly, by the time we hit our peak and then reach a new trough, that might be March, and who knows what new variant will be on the global radar then. Many countries on the African continent still have, the Democratic Republic of Congo has a population full vaccination rate of less than 1%. It's 0.2%. The global community has been painfully slow to realize what it means when we say no one is safe until we are all safe. So thinking about returning to normal when so many people on the planet are still not protected, I think is premature.
All right, Dr. Tan, as always, thank you so much for your insights, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Moving on now to our coverage of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics.
On the second day in the men's singles luge, South Korea's Lim Nam-kyu finished in 33rd place after his 3 races. He clocked a combined time of 3 minutes, 1.770 seconds, failing to qualify for the 4th and the final run, open only to the top 20 lugers. Johannes Ludwig of Germany took gold in the event, becoming Olympic men's luge champion for the first time. Ludwig finished 4 runs at the Yanqing Sliding Center in 3 minutes, 48.735 seconds, followed by competitors from Austria and Italy, respectively. In cross-country skiing, 2 South Korean skiers ranked below 60th position in the men's 30-kilometer skiathlon. Kim Min-woo and 62nd and Chung Jong-won at 66th. Alexander Bolshinov of the Russian Olympic Committee clinched the gold after crossing the finish line in 1 hour 16 minutes. He was 1 minute and 11 seconds ahead of his Russian teammate Denis Spitsov and more than 2 minutes ahead of the bronze medalist from Finland.
A female snowboarder from New Zealand has made history to win the country's first ever Winter Olympics gold medal in the women's snowboard slope style on Sunday. 20-year-old Zoi Sadowski-Synnott managed a score of 92.88 after a dramatic final run. She nailed a 3-jump sequence that none of her rivals could match. American Julia Morano won the silver, Australia's Tess Cody taking home the bronze. New Zealand had previously only won 1 silver and 2 bronze medals at the Winter Olympics. Japan's Ryoyu Kobayashi has won gold in the men's individual normal hill ski jumping event. The 25-year-old nailed the best jump of the first round with 145.4 points and finished with a total of 275 is the second gold for Japan in ski jumping history and the country's first since the 1972 Olympics in Sapporo. Austria's Manuel Fettner took silver and Brazil's David Kubacki the bronze. Kobayashi's brother also was in the event. He finished 27th.
And now we cross over to our Oh Se-young for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The Beijing Olympics are in full swing after Chinese President Xi Jinping declared the 2022 Games open on Friday. Held just 6 months after the delayed Tokyo 2020 Olympics, the Games are taking place amid an intense lockdown in China, where a more subdued opening ceremony was staged. The sporting event is also being held as the United States and other countries have pursued a diplomatic boycott of the Games over Beijing's human rights violations of its Uyghur population. We discussed the very unique dynamics of the Beijing Games as China takes centre stage for the second time in the Olympic history. For this, we're joined by Susan Brownell, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis, who has been researching sports and the Olympics in China for about 4 decades. We're also joined by Mason Ritchie, Associate Professor of International Relations at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. And well, let's begin with you, Professor Brownell. Now, well, you're an Olympic expert, really, and Olympic diplomacy expert as well. And well, I'm just curious to know how you're finding the Beijing Games so far, and also how it compares to the previous Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, which you also researched.
Well, it's not unusual that political controversy precedes every Games, and of course there were political tensions actually preceding the Pyeongchang Games, and they centered around North Korea. Those Games actually ended up with on a happy note. I mean, I met people on the streets in Gangneung that said maybe this, after all, will be the Peace Olympics, because North Korea ended up attending. There was a joint women's ice hockey team. The 2 North and South Korean teams marched into the stadium together, and progress was made in U.S.-North Korea relations, which eventually led to a summit in the summer. So those Games ended up with a feel-good sentiment when the Games were over. This time we have tensions between the US and China, and because of the diplomatic boycott by the Biden administration, I think it's less likely that we will end the Games with summits or other progress being made towards solving thorny political issues. So I'm less optimistic that these Games will end on the feel-good note that the Pyeongchang Games ended on.
I see. Well, as we all know, there's a diplomatic boycott going on staged by the United States, the UK, Australia, and a number of other Western countries, as well as countries like India. And well, Professor Brownell, does the diplomatic boycott of the Games directly affect the Games itself?
Well, I think, we could go back to other boycotts which were politically ineffective. And so I think it's likely that this effort will be politically ineffective also. But really what happens in the end is that the global audience is much more interested in the sports than the politics. And really whether politicians are present at the Games, even whether heads of state are present, is not something that gets a lot of attention or is remembered afterwards. I mean, leading up to the Beijing 2008 Games, there was a fairly large number of heads of state who said that they would not attend those opening ceremonies as a form of protest against China's treatment of Tibetans. And these days, nobody seems to remember that actually there was that diplomatic action then. So I kind of think that once the games start, the sports take over, and what the public remembers afterwards is the fantastic sports performances, the athletes, and the wonderful scenery.
And now, Professor Ritchie, to bring you into the conversation. Now, a lot has changed in the world since Beijing held its first Olympics in 2008. Of course, back then, it was more about China really coming out to the world and showing how it's been playing as a part of the international community. But of course, now with these boycotts and these diplomatic frictions with other countries that Beijing is facing, the situation is vastly different. And well, how has China's standing really changed since its 2008 Games?
So first of all, you're right that 2008 was intended to be China's coming out party, as you put it, and of course now there's no need for that. China is, along with the U.S., one of the two colossuses, striding along the world and determining quite a bit of what happens in international politics. So that's not really necessary. Instead, I think what we're seeing is that the Chinese Communist Party is looking at these games instead in part as a way to underline its competence, its wisdom in governance, to underline the effectiveness of its model of governing, or if you want to use a stronger word, of controlling society. It wants to underline the differences between the CCP system and approach to governance and those of Western countries in particular. And that, of course, is taking place in the background of COVID, where many of the Western countries, have not been very effective at dealing with COVID from an epidemiological perspective. Whereas China's embraced a near COVID zero policy, or pretty close to it, which has implicated some extremely draconian lockdowns. So I think that this attempt to try to underline party effectiveness is an important difference compared to 2008. I think the other thing is, China, I think definitely is more mixed now in terms of its global reception, the global opinion. In 2008, it was still possible, I think, for many people to see the sort of warm and fuzzy side of China, whereas now I think what we've seen over the last 15 years, of course, is that China can be extremely draconian, and I'll just say that the CCP, not necessarily the people of China. And I think that it's going to be a bit of a harder row for the CCP to try to win some positive PR out of these Olympics compared to 2008.
So we're seeing a much more assertive China. And well, Professor Brownell, how do you see the significance of the 2022 Games compared to the 2008 Olympics? What do you think the Chinese government's goals were in hosting these 2022 Games?
Well, as Professor Ritchie observed, in 2008, the meaning of the Games was clear. It was China's coming out party on the world stage as an equal with the other strong nations, and leaders had held that view of hosting the first Olympic Games for 100 years. So everybody was on board with the meaning of that Games. I think even when China was bidding in 2015, the meaning of this Games was less clear. They probably didn't even expect to win the bid, because normally it takes at least 2 tries before a city can win a bid. And so I'm not sure that they ever had a really clear message that they wanted to communicate. And then in the midst of the COVID pandemic, that changed everything anyway. So, mostly China has arrived, and maybe that's the message now. We are here, accept it. They are not backing down in terms of the criticism that they are enduring. And I think that's part of the message that they will communicate, which is that we are strong, we stand on our fundamental principles, and we will not compromise on them. So, but there are a lot of things going on underneath the surface that I do think are encouraging. And one thing I would just like to point out is that for the first time, China actually has a number of athletes at these games who were born and raised in other countries and who switched citizenship to represent China. And this was not even allowed before because China is so xenophobic and they never really encouraged citizenship switching. So at the same time that we see political tensions at quite a high at the level of politicians and rhetoric, I think there are some things happening at these games that could be a cause for optimism.
And Professor Ritchie, well, countries like Australia and those in the European Union, they took a clear stand against human rights abuses by China. And while South Korea hasn't, though, South Korean President Moon decided not to boycott the Beijing Olympics. Well, this also comes despite most South Koreans being rather wary of the Chinese government, according to recent polls by the Asan Institute here in Korea. And of course, there was also a lot of controversy building since last year as Chinese press and also Chinese officials, they were making some cultural claims over South Korea's cultural content, its traditional dress such as hanbok, and of course this also sparked a bit of outrage over the last few days as well as Chinese athletes dressed in hanbok, the Korean attire. They were wearing that at the Beijing Olympics. But well, amid all this controversy, why hasn't the issue been so clear-cut for the South Korean president? Why wasn't it taking a clear stance? I mean, what were really the calculations between President Moon Jae-in's his position on China?
Well, I don't have privy to what runs through President Moon's mind, but if I had to conjecture, I would say it's a pretty clear, realist calculation, that statesmen have to make all the time. Namely, in this particular case, Moon knows South Korea is heavily dependent on trade with China, both on the export and on the import side. China is South Korea's #1 export partner. It's responsible for critical component imports coming into Korea, which are very important for the economy here. South Korea, of course, also has memory of the way that China responded to South Korea's installation of a terminal high-altitude area defense battery here, which the U.S. requested, and resulted in it after its installation in extreme economic coercion by China against South Korea. Tens of billions of dollars in lost revenue through economic punishment, illegal economic punishment, I should note, by the way. By China against South Korea. I think a part of it, a very tiny part, but probably somewhere there in Moon's calculation, is wanting to keep Beijing on board with respect to policy towards Pyongyang. Although at the moment, I think that's probably likely to be the case anyway. So I don't think he would lose very much in this regard. And then I think, probably, Moon wants to leave the South Korea-China relationship on a decent footing when his successor takes office after the upcoming election in March. I think that's probably part of it as well. Compared to the other countries you mentioned, such as Australia or the EU, I guess I would simply say, look, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your neighbors in international politics. And, Australia was already antagonized by China and has been for the last few years, so it actually didn't cost it very much to go along with this diplomatic boycott. The EU, for its part, part of its soft power, part of its international reputation involves at least giving the perception of being very supportive of the human rights agenda. So it's extremely costly for the EU not to appear to support that. So the EU member states who joined, I think, in part, have to keep that in mind as well.
And well, President Moon didn't end up going to the Beijing Olympics after all, but there were in fact very few world leaders who ended up turning up at the Beijing Olympics due to COVID as well, of course. But Professor Brownell, now, China's foreign ministry said that Washington had clearly violated the Olympic spirit and, quote, will pay a price for its erroneous actions. However, it's not really specified what this price might be. What do you think is meant by this?
Well, I actually don't think there will be a price if we can look back at 2008 and see what happened then, for example. I mean, as I mentioned, there were heads of state then who protested, not only by not attending the opening ceremony, but also by inviting the Dalai Lama to their countries and receiving him as an honored guest ahead of time, which always provokes Chinese anger. And if you look at the context, the already existing relations between China and those countries that chose to take those actions, there were already tensions anyway, and this was just reflecting an already existing pattern. And so I think what happened in 2008 and probably what will happen now is that there won't be any specific retribution from China for this one action, but rather that these relations will continue as they were, which is to say there were tensions and ongoing negotiations in any case. I mean, if any of these countries are hosting a mega event in the near future, it could be that China will not send any government officials or the head of state will not attend. But there aren't that many mega events on the level of the Olympics which get that amount of media scrutiny. So China won't have that many opportunities. I mean, maybe the FIFA World Cup upcoming in Qatar, but Qatar is not one of the problem countries.
And Professor Brownell, do you think Beijing will change its behaviour and perhaps improve its human rights situations as Western nations boycott the Games and continue their diplomatic pressure, probably beyond the Olympics as well?
Well, I think history shows that Olympic boycotts have been ineffective. We can think back to the Cold War boycotts in 1980 and 1984 when there was the mutual tit-for-tat boycott by the US and the Soviet Union. And it's generally agreed that they were completely ineffective and only harmed the athletes. And that is a phrase that you hear even today. And that's the reason that since the end of the Cold War, there actually haven't been any national boycotts when nations did not send any athletes. And that's why Biden chose something else, this so-called diplomatic boycott, which is actually a new diplomatic tool that has never been tried before. So, I mean, we can see what happens, but history doesn't give us encouragement that it will produce any real effects on the ground in China. And if you look at the pressure that China was under in 2008 and how it responded afterwards, the main response was in the area of foreign communications, because China decided that it didn't have a big enough presence and voice in the international media. And so it invested in infrastructure and in extending the international reach of its own media so that it could get its vision out there in the world to counteract the attacks in the Western media. So, you know, after this Olympic Games, they'll probably be assessing whether that effort was successful. And if anything changes, it may be that they will continue to work in this area of communications and perhaps won't actually do anything to change the on-the-ground situations that attracted the criticism in the first place.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we'll have to close the interview. That was Susan Brownell, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and Mason Ritchie, Associate Professor of International Relations at Hangul University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Now in sports, the South Korean women's football team have finished as the runners-up at the 2022 Asian Cup, losing 3-2 to China on Sunday in Mumbai. Playing their first ever Asian Cup final, South Korea took a 2-0 lead in the first half thanks to goals from Che Yuri and Ji So-yeon. However, with 3 unanswered goals from China in the second half, South Korea had to settle for second place, but still, that's their best finish to date. Now let's take a look at what's going on around the world, and for that we have our Lee Seung-jae joining us from the Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
So let's start off in the UK, where Queen Elizabeth II marked 70 years on the throne. Certainly a remarkable accomplishment.
Right, certainly is, because like you said, Queen Elizabeth II, who at the age of 95 years young, celebrated her 70th year on the throne on Sunday, as she reviewed plans for her Platinum Jubilee. Well, not only has she become Britain's longest reigning sovereign, but she's continued to carry out official duties well into her 90s. Now, she became the Queen of Britain in more than a dozen other realms, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, on the death of her father, King George VI, on February 6, 1952, while she was in Kenya on an international tour. While this weekend saw low-key events, it'll be a prelude to more ceremonies to mark the Platinum Jubilee in June. Meanwhile, the Queen on Saturday said she wants Prince Charles's wife Camilla to be Queen Consort when he becomes king, cementing her place at the heart of the royal family. Now, Charles and Camilla married in 2005 in a civil ceremony in Windsor. And Camilla had once been judged as an outsider, but Elizabeth's move now reflects a wider acceptance of Camilla's status as a royal. Now, Costa Ricans headed to the polls on Sunday to cast their votes for their next president. Only this time, they have a record 25 presidential candidates to choose from. With a record number of candidates, none of them are expected to win more than 40% of the votes, the threshold needed to avoid a runoff. The election is likely to see a second-round vote in early April, and the latest race is to replace center-left President Carlos Alvarado. Now, while polls say about one-third of the voters in the Central American nation are unsure about who to vote for, they do want their next leader to tackle corruption and high unemployment rates as a priority during the four-year term. Now, at least 3 people were killed in southeastern Madagascar on Sunday after Cyclone Batsarai made landfall, leaving a trail of devastation. Authorities say roads were flooded and houses were submerged. This comes as Batsarai swept inland late Saturday with heavy rain and wind speeds of 165 kilometers per hour. The latest storm follows Cyclone Anna, which hit the island just 2 weeks ago, killing 55 people and displacing 130,000 people. And finally, the IOC said Sunday will proceed with a meeting with former world #1 doubles tennis player Peng Shuai during the Beijing Winter Games. However, the IOC did not give further details of the meeting. Now, this comes as the well-being of the Chinese star became a matter of concern in November, when she appeared to allege on social media that a former Chinese vice premier had sexually assaulted her in the past. The IOC has stated that it would support her if she wanted her allegations to be investigated. However, Peng said in December that she had never accused anyone and that the post she made had been misunderstood.
Good morning. The severe cold snap continues with cold wave alerts remaining in place across the central region, so please dress extra warmly on your way out. But daytime highs will go up slightly compared to yesterday, and we should notice a gradual rise in temperatures this week. It's going to feel much more bearable from tomorrow afternoon, but we'll need to also keep an eye on the dust levels as the warmth arrives. It's another dry day for eastern parts of the country, and even here in the capital, we are under a dry weather advisory. Along with strong winds, very high fire danger concerns are expected across the east and here in the capital. Central inner regions are having lows below -10 degrees Celsius. Chuncheon starting the day at -13 degrees, Daejeon at -8 degrees Celsius this morning. Afternoon highs will be 1 to 3 degrees higher this afternoon, so Seoul should go up to 3 degrees Celsius. Daegu, Daejeon, Gwangju will peak at 5 degrees under mostly sunny skies, while Jeju Island could see a light wintry mix tonight. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Tuesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.